Okay, so today what we're going to talk about is drying barley, but we're going to talk about it kind of from like a Irish context. So I actually got this slide deck from our agronomy colleagues out in Ireland, and they have a unique style of bringing in barley to their malting plants and drying it. So as I'm sharing this information from you, just remember that it's in a Irish context, so not everything here might fit for your operation, but think about some of the things that are going on in Ireland, and maybe think about how you might use that in a Canadian context. But maybe okay, so this is a presentation about barley in Ireland, but I took that beautiful picture on the right-hand side of the screen in northern Saskatchewan. So a little bit about the company first. So Prairie Malt is located in Biggar, Saskatchewan. That's where our processing facility is. At full capacity, we make about 240,000 tons of malt per year. Now, malt and barley is different through the process. Barley shrinks because when we sell malt, we sell it at about 4% moisture. So that's 240,000 tons of malt. We began operations over 40 years ago with our Wunderhofen unit being built in 1977. And as of November 2019, we were purchased by a company called Boortmalt. And Boortmalt is owned by a collective of farmers, a farm cooperative in France called Axriel. So Prairie Malt is now, it's a farmer-owned business. And it's also a global business. So we have malting plants globally. We're on 5 different continents, 16 countries, and we have 27 different malting plants worldwide. And what we're going to talk about today, if you guys can see my cursor hovering over the screen, we're talking about the malt plant today in Athy, Ireland. In Athy, Ireland, and to give you an idea of what that might look like, here's a picture of our malt plant there. So on the top left corner of the screen, you can see our malting operations, and kind of you can start to see a little bit of farmland in the top right, excuse me, as well. And just note that, okay, you can see some of these croplands, or maybe the paddocks there are quite a bit smaller than the quarter sections, half sections, and sections might deal with in North America. So I'm going to skip over those last few slides. They're pretty wordy. I'm just going to read off that, but I'll stick on this slide because this is the stuff that you should kind of drill into your brain. So in Ireland, they actually purchase and have delivered almost 100% of their barley at harvest time. And then Boortmalt, Ireland, they dry that barley down once they receive it. So the climatic conditions at harvest in Ireland result in grain moisture varying from approximately 21.5 to 15% moisture. Okay, so Ireland is quite humid, and they don't have the warm days that we do. In fact, interesting kind of just factoid. So it's February now. In March, they're going to start to seed their spring barley, right? And then that's not going to get harvested till probably mid-July through August. So that's a much longer growing season too, just because you don't have the same heat units that we do here. So they don't get, barley that's really dry at harvest, so they have to dry it down. So the barley comes off, and it's between 21 to 25 or 21.5% moisture to 15% moisture. And the trucks that they deliver the barley to are actually only 18 tons. So they're pretty small lots. And there's really it's very heterogeneous moisture content of those lots. So as these 18-ton lots come into the malting plant, they have the hydraulic probe. They probe every single lot, and they measure the moisture content. And they say, okay, what is this? If it's above 17.5 or equal to 17.5% moisture, they're going to bin that in one area. And if it's lower than 17.5% moisture, they're going to bin that in another area. And the reason for this segregation is due to the fact that they find that their grain dryers are most efficient when they're removing 4% moisture or less. If they're trying to, 6% moisture out of the grain, they're not going to do that. They realize that's the best management practice. So they're going to actually start to dry in different lots. So if you're at 17.5% moisture that's been segregated into one bin, they're going to dry that down to 13.5%, which is generally your contract spec. But if it's above that 17.5% moisture, they're going to dry that down to 16.5% moisture. And then they're actually going to keep that barley now that's at 16.5, and they're going to wait for a couple of weeks till they've, because they have a lot of barley coming in at one time. So they're going to take that 16.5%, they're going to put it aside, say, okay, that's going to be safe for a few weeks. Let's process the rest. We're going to add to that pile of 16.5. And once they're done, they'll double dry that 16.5 down to the 13.5 moisture content that they're aiming for. And so you can kind of see that here. They dry by moisture class. So it's above 17.5, dry it down to 16.5. And if it's 17.5 lower, they're drying that to a stable moisture for long-term storage. And they want it to be below 14. I mean, in North America, your barley contracts are going to be 13.5, and that's best. That's what you should target. But that's what they do in Ireland. Yeah, so they attempt to dry all of the barley that they receive within 72 hours. And because there's, time is, you'll see in a later slide, but high moisture and high temperature barley, it's very time sensitive. And I think you saw that probably earlier in the PAMI presentation. It's really time sensitive as to getting that barley dried right away, ensure its quality long-term. In terms of air temperatures, they don't want the on-air temperature to get higher than 68 degrees Celsius. And their max grain temperature then would be 32 degrees Celsius. After, as the barley is coming out of the dryer, they sample every 10 tons. And for a lot, they're going to sample 10 times. So they're going to have 100 tons of sample represented. And they're going to check the moisture, the dockage, and the germination capacity on those lots. The reason they do that is just to make sure that they aren't going to move that lot into a larger bulk of barley and have a germ that won't work for their malting operations. I think it's probably clear for everyone, but the reason they're so careful with the drying temps is because in malting barley, you must preserve the germ end in order for that barley to be turned into malt. If it doesn't grow, it will not go on to be malt later. So I'm going to leave this slide soon, but before I do, let's just touch on a couple things here. So you saw that the paddock size in Ireland is pretty small. Yours are not like that. And when we're looking at the moisture classes of, greater than 17.5 or less than 17.5, well, there's probably a lot of variability in moisture in your fields. So when you're harvesting, let's say you're harvesting 17.5% barley, that's your average that you got off 1/4 section. Just remember that that average is going to be composed of a whole bunch of different moistures. If you've ever taken any stats classes, you might have heard about the danger of relying too much on averages. If you come to a river and you can't swim and you need to cross it, and someone tells you, okay, the averages of this river is 3 feet deep, do you cross it? Well, when the risk is that great because you can't swim, maybe you shouldn't, because there might be some areas of that river that are 100 feet deep. And so just remember that when you're, pulling off large volumes of grain from your field, although the average might be 17.5, there might be grain in there that's 20% and above, and just keep those numbers in mind when we get to a matrix that shows later in the presentation that shows how grain temperature and moisture content will affect the storability of grain. Okay, but let's assume that you've dried your barley, you've dried it low and slow, so you haven't exceeded a grain temp of 42 degrees Celsius, and now it's in storage. Now what? Next steps. Okay, so you don't want to store barley that's hot. You're going to want to cool it down, probably through aeration. So I'll just start to read this next section here. So safely dried malting barley will arrive at the designated storage point in Ireland again. at a temperature of approximately 25 degrees Celsius daytime temperature after dryer, up to 30 degrees Celsius. Okay. It is in this storage, it's in the storage period that most damage will occur to the germination end of, or to barley germination. I think we all know that, due to loss of germination, infection by fungal entities, production of mycotoxins. So we want to aerate the malting barley that we dry after, we want to aerate after drying, initially attempting to reduce the temperature of that grain lot down to 15 degrees Celsius. And then after that, 10 degrees Celsius for longer term storage. And we'll touch on this later in just a few minutes here. It should be noted that in Ireland, the relative humidity is greater than 85% most of the time, which means we have to be extremely careful when pressing air through the bulk of grain, because whilst cooling, moisture can be removed from the air, deposited on the surface of grain, activating fungal activity, heating loss, loss of germination, yada, yada. You've probably heard that already. So in order to prevent such moisture transfer, Boortmalt operates on the following policy. Only aerate if the delta or difference in temperature is 5 degrees Celsius or greater between the lowest grain temperature in the bulk and the ambient air being pressed through the grain. So they want to make sure that there's at least a 5 degrees C difference to make sure that they're cooling in obviously high relative humidity conditions. So talking about more of a North American context, after barley is, after our barley has been dried, we need to cool it down. And I would recommend in winter, if you can, turn on your aeration fans. Like, you're not trying to dry it down anymore. You just want to keep it cool. Let's actually move here. So this matrix shows at different barley moistures and different temperatures how long your barley can last. And basically, as you move to the left, upper left quadrant, you'll see that at lowest grain moistures and the lowest temperatures, obviously, you're going to have barley that lasts the longest time. So talking about a North American context, one of the things that we do at the malt plant is once we have the barley in, it's dry and sound. When it's, like temperatures like last week, when you wake up and it's -51 with wind chill, we're going to turn on the aeration fans, just because we want that barley to be cold. We want to basically make that an icicle, because we aren't going to bring it from the bins until July, August. And when we do actually bring it from the bins, you can see on the leg of that bin, there'll be condensation on the leg. It'll be dripping with water because the barley that we've kept in our long-term storage is so cold. And we found that to be a really effective way of maintaining germ quality. So, I mean, this isn't rocket science. I think these two slides cover it. Well, there is actually quite a bit of science. You can see this, but this general practices. Dry within 72 hours if you have high moisture barley. If you're taking your barley off above 17.5% moisture, make sure that you're drying twice. You might have to. And remember that there's high variability in your fields, okay? Don't exceed or on-air temperature of 68 degrees C, and don't exceed a grain temperature of 42 degrees C. Cool your barley to 15 degrees C as soon as possible after drying, and cool to 10 degrees C or lower for long-term storage. If you can turn your aeration fan in winters to cool down your barley, that might be a good idea if you have contracts for later delivery. Of course, as mentioned in the PAMI presentation, it might not be a good idea to aerate when it's really rainy or foggy if cooling down grain is your goal. And just a visual example of why we do that. This is a quick picture of different fungi species that are active in your grain, in your bins, and the temperatures and moistures that they thrive at, that they're active at. And basically, again, you can see that as you reduce your grain temperature and you reduce your grain moisture, you're going to have less fungal organisms flourishing in storage. So big ones that we're looking out for are Aspergillus, Penicillium, field fungi like Fusarium that can produce mycotoxins, though they're not so aggressive in bins because they're not storage fungi, they're field fungi. But really, you want to keep the grain temperature low. You want to keep it at low moisture as well. And that's really it. I can maybe freeze on this slide for a few moments, but most of your contracts are going to be at probably 13.5 grain moisture. So if you can keep so looking kind of right here on the graph, so if you can keep your barley at 10 degrees C and 13.5% grain moisture, it should store for about 300 days. And that's really it. I don't know where I am at for time here, but we can move on to the discussion when we're ready.
There was a question that Drew had answered online, and it talked about the Prairie Malt supplying malt to what areas and needs of the world. And you had said US, Mexico, Asia Pacific, and locally. So if you want to add some more on to that, and also, is there barley from Western Canada that is shipped over to Ireland to that malt plant there?
So no, we do not ship any barley to Ireland. A lot of the purchasers in Ireland are very concerned about having locally sourced barley. So if you're looking at some of the big brewers in Ireland, they want to be able to say, okay, we've bought barley from our Irish growers, and that's an important part of their branding. So not right now, but maybe in the future. We produce the world's best barley here in Saskatchewan, so maybe one day. But big target markets are US, so that's going to be our main customer. Asia Pacific after that. Mexico is also a big one. And that's the majority, and of course locally. But our local market is really very small. I mean, our batch size is about 640 tons per day. So we could produce malt for a few weeks and would probably flood the Saskatchewan market for a year. Like literally, that's probably not, I'm not doing the numbers on that, but that's probably not much of an exaggeration. So yeah, we are definitely exporters from our facility.
Just wanted to hear Drew's comments on cooling barley down quickly in Saskatchewan versus Ireland, when our barley harvest is often in August or early September. Is it better for Saskatchewan to be set up to get barley dried down with either heated grain drying or supplemental heat drying and aeration?
So that's a good question. Obviously, there's some differences between cooling barley in Ireland and Canada. And I mean, I think a lot of these things depend on operation. Like so many of these things are very much dependent upon what a producer has available to him on his farm. Like for a long time in Saskatchewan, I think maltsters were against using grain bags, but something we've actually found is that grain bags, because they have a larger surface area, can be a good way to cool down malt barley short term, even so you maybe had it in your dryer to cool, and putting it in a grain bag because the temperature drops fairly quickly if the ambient temperature is cool. But to answer the question, so is it better for us to be set up to get barley dried down with either heated grain drying or supplemental heat and aeration? I don't know the answer to that. I think it really depends on what you have within your operation. And I'm really not a specialist on supplemental aeration for drying down barley. In fact, I mean, I'm not really a grain drying specialist. I just have the presentation from Ireland. So maybe Charley has some comments on that as well.
For kind of working in bin with malt barley, definitely had that question posed, and we've kind of mulled around with it, but haven't gone into much detail. Definitely, as you mentioned, that maintaining the germ and from a quality perspective is really important. So adding heat, the benefit of supplemental heat is, you're not exceeding that. I think in your presentation you had 40 degrees Celsius for seed temperature. So it could definitely be a good option. So lower temperature drying using the supplemental heat. So it might be a project that we look at doing in our facility.